Okay. Welcome, everyone. I think we are now live online, and I will wait a few seconds to let everybody connect to the session, and then we will start. Okay, I see some people are still connecting, but maybe I will launch the webinar right now. So welcome all. Thank you for connecting to this webinar today. I'm Céline PAJON. I'm head of Japan research with the Center for Asian Studies at Ifri. And I will be chairing the session. So we will talk about Africa today. As you could see, every 3 years there is this TICAD summit, which is the Japan-Africa summit that is taking place and which gather Japanese representatives from the government, but also the companies, NGOs, as well as their African counterparts and some international organizations. They gather once in Japan and in Africa, and they're trying to reflect on the cooperation policy of Japan in Africa, on the evolving situation on the continent, and try to rethink the priority to come in the bilateral relations. So I think it's a very good opportunity to also compare notes between France and Japan, because France and Japan has a very long and strong partnership and relationship, especially in Africa. France has its own special history with Africa. So Japan has been interested to reach out to French counterparts to exchange views and exchange analysis on what's going on there, and try to best find some synergy to best work together and enhance their cooperation on the continent. So the latest TICAD was a TICAD 8, and it was held in Tunisia end of August. We had a couple of important announcements that we will discuss later on during this session. And since the latest iteration of the TICAD summit, it was back in 2019, two very important international crises happened. First, the COVID-19 pandemics, and then the war in Ukraine. And of course, it caused already a lot of important evolution, development, geopolitical development, and the African continent have been impacted in many ways. So the question we would like to raise today is first to compare notes between the France and Japan on the current situation in Africa, and how has Japan and France adapted their cooperation policy on the continent, how this the COVID-19 and war in Ukraine impacted Africa and impacted on the policy, the development policy of Japan and France in the region. And so for this discussion, we are very lucky to have a great panel of experts with us. And I will quickly introduce them to you. First, I have the great pleasure to welcome Mika Inoue Hanzawa. She was kind enough to jump in to take over from the Professor Sadalu Kataoka, who was supposed to talk, but unfortunately he couldn't make it today. So thanks a lot, Mika, for jumping in. Mika is a professor at the Toyo Gakuen University, and she is currently academic visitor at the University of Oxford. So you can see Oxford behind her with, with quite a nice weather. And Mika will talk about the last TICAD, and she will explain about the main achievement, challenges, and talk also about the general Japanese cooperation policy in Africa. And then we will have Étienne Giros, who is the president of the CIAN, Conseil français des investisseurs en Afrique, so the French Council for Investors in Africa. He will provide a view from the private sector, the French private sector, on the evolving cooperation in Africa, and maybe make some recommendation for the future. After that, I'm very happy to have Sayoko Uesu with us today. She is a senior researcher at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, the CRIPS. And she will focus on the impact of the COVID and war in Ukraine on the security situation in Africa, and the impact, of course, on Japan policy and much more, because she is a great expert on the region. Last but not least, we are very glad to have Christine Holzbauer. She is an international reporter with Financial Afrique and other media, I believe. And she will offer her comments and perspective about the current situation in Africa and the latest development, important development in the French policy and cooperation policy in Africa, and much more again, because we will discuss also on how Japan and France can enhance their cooperation in the region. So I will ask each of you to first present your view for 10 minutes or so, and then I will make you react to each other. And then we will open the floor to the question. So I'm already asking the audience to think about your own question, and please write them down in the Q&A box of the Zoom window, so that I can relay them to our panelists afterwards. So I would just like to remind that this webinar is on the record. It is live streamed right now. And so you will find the video available on the YouTube channel of Ifri very soon. A last very short remark is that Professor Inoue Hanzawa will have to leave a bit early. So if you have a specific question for her, don't wait until the end, because she won't be there anymore. So without further ado, thank you a lot for your patience, dear panelists. I would like to open the first roundtable now, and starting with Mika Inoue Hanzawa. Mika, the floor is yours for your remarks.
Okay, thank you very much, Céline, and good morning, everyone, as well as good evening, everyone. Let me pick up the ambition and the result of the TICAD 8 first, generally. Then I would like to point out the agenda for Japanese government in terms of cooperation in Africa. Maybe as you already know, in TICAD, there are three pillars: economy, social development, and peace and security. And in TICAD 8, there was a common keyword from my point of view. There was a common keyword. It was sustainability. So in terms of the first pillar economy, it was mainly focused on the transformation of the business. And there was big achievement, and it was green investment, as well as the promotion of investment, particularly by young people, both in Japan and Africa. I think it is very good, important momentum, both for Japan and African society. At the same time, however, there was the challenge for Japan. It was the magic word of the 30 billion investment. It was a little bit controversial at the end of TICAD 8, particularly in Japanese media, because it includes much amount of investments by the private sector. So there was both achievement and challenge. In fact, in 2017, for example, according to the statistic of JETRO, Japanese direct investment to Africa was $7.8 billion. It was only 12% of France and only 18% of China. So, okay. And the second pillar is social development. And in this area, the keyword is resilience. And one of the big achievement as well for Japan is, of course, the universal health coverage. It is essential, particularly in the era of COVID-19, because much resource for development has already been shifted to the situation in Ukraine. So universal health coverage is not only important in the era of COVID-19, but also in the situation in war in Ukraine. And at the same time, again, here is a challenge for Japan in terms of social development. It was the limited participation of civil societies for TICAD 8. It was pity that it was negative impact of COVID to the TICAD 8. And if TICAD pursue the concept of democracy, good governance, it should be much more encouraged for the participation, both Japanese and African civil societies. I think the participation of civil societies for TICAD is very good tradition for TICAD for long years. So this is a challenge in the era of pandemic. And the third pillar is peace and stability. I think there was two achievements. One is focusing on the special agenda, particularly appointing an ambassador, special envoy for the Horn of Africa to respond swiftly to the complex challenges facing this region. This region, Horn of Africa, has complex emergency, not only conflict, violent extremism, but also the severe famine for recent years. So focusing on this region is very important for Japan and Africa. Another achievement was the support for Sahel region countries in stabilization. And again, there are several challenges for Japan in terms of peace and security. One is the commitment to the peace building through the UN peace operations, because UN peace operations in Africa heavily relies on both Ukraine and Russia in terms of the personnel, as well as important facilities such as helicopters. UN is dying for getting helicopters to dispatch food distribution and many operations in Africa. So both Ukraine and Russia withdrawal from UN peace operation in Africa, particularly in the Sahel region, is a big challenge, not only for Japan, but also for international community. Another challenge for Japan in terms of peace and security would be the reform of the UN Security Council. It has become much harder to seek cooperation in this issue after the Russian invasion to Ukraine. So now let me point out agenda for Japanese cooperation in Africa in post-COVID and war in Ukraine. The challenge for Japan would be how Japan can tackle and handle cross-cutting issues among three peers, not only for each peer, but also many issues connected by three peers. For example, the combination of social business, civil society participation, and free and open values shared commitment to Africa would be very big agenda for Japan. And for second example would be counterterrorism with universal health coverage and humanitarian assistance access. This is very important, for example, in Horn of Africa as well as Sahel region. And maybe third example would be the combination of climate change, food security, and peace operations. In the area of peace operations, climate change is very, very big issues for a few years. So generally, TICAD 8 got many achievements, but as at the same time, there are many challenges and agenda for both Japan and for African countries. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mika. Thank you for the excellent overview of the TICAD, and thank you for underlining the achievement, but also the challenges. And I would be later on very interested to hear the other panelists' views about the challenges you underline, and also your very interesting point on how to handle the cross-cutting issues. I think indeed this is a common challenge for everybody. We tend to work in kind of silos, and it's very difficult to break silos and to trigger some coordination at the domestic level between our different agencies. So when it comes to handling such a cross-cutting issue at the international level with partners, it's getting even more complicated. So I think that's indeed a very important issue to look at. And now I will go to Etienne Giros, who will provide a French perspective, and especially from the companies, the private sector, and so on. Etienne, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Céline, and hello, everyone. I'm very happy and proud to be with you today, especially because I know that I am the only male panelist in this team. So thank you very much to accept me. Let me precise that, yes, I am representing the French private sector invested in Africa, but also the European one, because I am also the president of EPCAM, which means European Business Council for Africa, which is an European association based in Brussels, which brings together the kind of CIAN organization in 14 countries. So we are covering, in other terms, the European private sector invested in Africa as well. So I have two hats, a French one and also a European. So yes, I think the situation and the framework of our business in Africa has been rather fundamentally changed and moved since those two events, which are the COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine. And let me maybe show from the point of view, the private sector point of view, explain to you what are the difference between the old days, which are not very far, 2 years ago, and now, and what could be the new perspectives in the future and the new cooperation tools to develop. Yes, before those two events, let's say during the last 25 years before those 2 years, we were facing a rather stable environment or framework of business, which was composed of positive and negative points. The strong points are rather well known. Let me remind you the strong points. First one, the African potential, which is and which was huge. Population, size of the population, 1 billion people in addition in the coming 30 years, growth of the and of course the huge amount of raw materials. Second strong point, the entry of this continent into the globalization and the globalization of the economy. I am sure you are totally aware of the fact that 30 or 40 years ago, Africa was rather a closed continent. Now, the big difference is it is totally open-minded, thanks to internet, thanks to privatization, thanks to education, not only focused on, for example, Europe and Russia, like in the old days, but now everywhere in the world. Well, in a few words, it's totally an open continent now. The third strong point I would like to explain, and to you to be sure of that, is the fact that this continent is a profitable continent. At the end of the day, when you invest in Africa, yes, sometimes it's a little bit complicated, it's a little bit disappointing, but at the end of the day, the operators, the companies are making money. And is it not the first and the main positive point to push the investors to put money in Africa? Yes, it is. And the last point I would like to mention on the strong point is the fact it is maybe a difference between France and Japan, because our panel today is supposed to make and to point some difference between our two countries. I think the positive point is the fact that we are living a very strong, very close experience and relationship between our countries, European countries, and especially France and Europe and Africa. We have a long common history. We have very strong and very close relationship. We are friends. We know us both very well. Africa knows us very well, but Europeans know Africa very well also. It is an advantage. It is an advantage. So I put it in the good and positive point. Now, of course, everything is not being, it is not always a blue sky, not like in Oxford. But we are also facing weak points. I would like to mention 2 or 3 weak points. The first one is the rule of law. We were facing sometimes a poor rule of law, which is not positive for an investor. An investor wants to have stability, and the lack of rule of law is really a danger. The second point, of course, everyone is aware of that, is a question of security. And especially in Sahel, the fight yes, in the fight against the terrorism and Islamic fighters and the battle against Islamic opponents, especially in Mali, in Niger, and so on, and sometimes elsewhere, also in Eastern Africa. It is a risk and it is a danger. Third point, we are, and we were, since 30 years, facing another point, which is maybe not very well known, but which is the fact that a lot of operators of actors, of economic actors, are afraid of the bad reputation they could have to face by working in Africa on the social networks, regarding the NGOs attacks and so on, you see. And I know a lot of companies who think that if they invest in Africa, they will probably have a reputation, not right, but they will have to face a reputation issue, maybe. And if you compare the reputation issue and the size of the market, it is a problem and it is a break to invest in Africa. That was the last point is the size of the markets. I want to explain you that the problem of that is, yes, Africa is the future of the world and the planet. And yes, it is a place for the future growth and wealth of the planet. But we have 54 countries and the size of each market is small. So when you are comparing the necessary amount to invest and the risk you are facing, maybe, or the impression of risk with the size of the market, it could be a problem. So yes, I finish with that point. It was to explain you the environment in which we were working during 30 years, the last 30 years. Now, what has changed? The framework since 24 months has fundamentally changed. The first change, let me explain you and maybe mention 3 or 4 reasons of this change. The first change is the difficulties in finding fundings and money to finance business. There is a kind of new banks' reluctance to finance economy. And I can assure you that it is a reality. It is not official. It is because there is a kind of aversion to risk. And this affects especially the SMEs, middle-sized or small-sized companies. The big groups, the big international groups are not facing this problem. So it's the reason why it is not very well known. But the difficulties of finding money you are facing it through the huge amount of guarantees which are requested, the cost of interest between 6, 7, 8%, up to 16% per year. You can imagine. And the last point is the problem that you don't find money. You cannot get your loans. That's the first difficulty and the first new difficulty. The second one is the inflation, and especially the cost of energy. I was speaking during those last days with operators acting in Africa, and yes, they are afraid of this new danger. It is a danger. When your energy, the cost of your energy is increasing of 50, 60, 70%, and it represents 20% of your costs, you can imagine what becomes your price. So yes, it is really a risk. It is not a special risk in Africa, but it is a risk very important in Africa. The third one is the logistics risk and danger. We are facing a cost and insufficient supply in logistics. First, as you know, the prices of logistics are extraordinarily increased, of sometimes 700%, 1,000% in addition. Now it's a little bit decreasing, but it is a danger. And the second point is that there is a lack of logistics and the lack of means. And what's happening, as the markets of Africa is rather small, the arbitration of the operators is made in favor of the North. And when you are lacking, and there are not enough vessels, there are not enough ships, for example, those ships are used for the North, for the traffic between, example, Europe and Asia and Japan. And so Africa is becoming in second row So yes, our operators are facing, this is a specific new risk and difficulty. The fourth risk, and it will be nearly the last, it is the increased pressure on compliance and environmental issues. We are living, and despite the crisis, new regulations, new standards in compliance issues. We are not against this point. We are in favor of compliance, of good governance, and so on, the protection of the planet, the human rights, and so on. There is no problem with that. The only problem we are facing is that approximately 50% of the planet is not under this regulation, which are China, India, Turkey, are not under this regulation. And when you are increasing such standard, we are creating a kind of weakness of our economies against the new actors. And secondly, it creates a very huge and very heavy and sometimes tiring bureaucracy. And business is becoming complicated and more complicated. So that's a new situation, and I can assure you that the discussions I have with operators, this point is very, very often mentioned. And I take my European hat to explain that to you. So this conclusion of this new framework, I would like to resume it, or to sum up it in one word. There is an increase of aversion to risk. When you are facing a war situation in a planet, when you are facing a pandemic, there is an aversion of risk. And this aversion of risk is much more focused on a new continent like Africa. And when you are in an investment committee, for example, you say, look now, we have to take risks. Yes, the situation is more difficult. The first target to decrease investment is Africa, due to what I explained to you before. So now, not to conclude, but to finish, I would like to propose to you several paths, or maybe new areas or priorities to face this new situation. It is my own choice. Everyone is not in the obligation to share my views, but I would like to share my views on that, and I would like to propose to you 4 new areas to invest on. The first one is the agriculture and the agro-industry sector. We have to strengthen agriculture sector in Africa to increase autonomy of Africa, and of course to help Africa to answer to the problem of difficulty to get crops and so on. Yes, agriculture. And we have a lot of competence and expertise in Europe and probably in Japan as well in this field. The second point I propose is to invest very much and very strongly in energy sector, and especially in green and clean energy sector. Yes, it is a future. And you see, I don't speak of environment investment, but I speak of on energy sector investment. Yes, let's focus on this sector to increase autonomy and sovereignty of Africa on this regard. Third idea I would like to share with you. We have to invest in education. It is a very old idea, that it's not new, but it's becoming newer and newer now, because it's absolutely urgent to fix population and to increase inclusion and to increase local content. yes, we have to produce added value in Africa. And we will not manage to do it if we don't invest in education. At us, I speak to everyone of us, don't forget to continue to invest in education despite this crisis. This crisis has not to prevent us to invest in education, because we have to focus on that. And the last proposal I would like to share with you is that I think it's absolutely now the time to establish a new private-public financing tools. It is not enough developed. I observe that there are a huge amount of financing, of public financing from Europe and thanks to TICAD and so on, from Japan, dedicated to Africa, huge. But you will notice that nearly all those amounts are dedicated to public sector. So it's public to public. It is European Union, local investment fund and so on, to African states. After that, it comes to tenders and so on to private sector. But doing that, I see two difficulties. The first one, we don't take advantage of the huge inventivity of private sector. We have a lot of projects, us private companies, a lot of projects. And we are not asked to propose our projects. So don't pass always through the states. Directly ask, organize call to projects, to private projects, because our projects represent investments, represent tax, represent education, and at the end of the day, represent wealth. And secondly, I think I already mentioned this point, but we have to improve the productivity of the international aid. It is too much bureaucratic. And I am advocating really to create a tool, a 50-50 tool, private-public, which would manage a small part of the international public funds dedicated to Africa towards the private sector. So that's my fourth idea I would like to share to you. To finish now, because I have finished, Céline, to finish, I think that the new context should not slow down the private investment in Africa. It is not the time. On the contrary, it is exactly the moment and the time to invest much more in Africa. Why? For only one very simple reason. It's because the fundamentals remain positive. So yes, do it now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Etienne. It was excellent, very articulated and a very complete presentation. And thank you for your recommendation. I think we will discuss them afterwards. I see the time is running, and maybe as Mika, and Zawa, we'll have to leave early. If Sayoko, you agree with that, I would like to go back to Mika first, maybe to be sure to get she had the chance to provide a reaction to Etienne's presentation, because I think he raised a couple of issues. She also raised regarding the question of the private investment, and the Japanese private investment also has a difficulty to step up in Africa. And also I would like to address you, Mika, some questions. One about Japan's and its initiative to tackle the food crisis in East Africa. This is a question from Alain Antil, our director of the African program here at Ifri. And another one on maybe the main change that you saw in the Japanese development assistance to Africa to ensure that the new objectives are met. Maybe you can start with that, and then we will follow up with Sayoko and Christine.
Okay, thank you very much. Sayoko-san, thank you for giving me extra time in advance of your presentation. And yes, thank you very much, Etienne, for your great presentation. I am totally agree with you in terms of the importance of investing the area of education, particularly because Japanese government point out the importance of the investment for human resource in TICAD 8 very strongly. So I am the professor in university in Tokyo, for example, and there should be much more student exchange that can be connected to the employment both in Japan and Africa. It would be very important for the human exchange between Japan and Africa. So I'm totally agree with the importance of the 4 areas Etienne pointed out, particularly in the area of education. And I assume several questions already we got several questions already from audience, and one of the question for Etienne from me is as well as the question from audience. It's close, very close. It is the possibility and impact of the African continental free trade area. Etienne mentioned the size of market for each African countries. It's relatively small, not so big. Then me and audience are interested in the possibility of the African continental free trade area. Etienne, what do you think of the impact of the improvement of this scheme in terms of investment from outside of the African countries? And very one short comment to the food security in Horn of Africa. It's very severe and important situation. And I'm not sure whether the Japanese government exactly how many or how much aid sending to this region, but much more broader context, why Japanese government focusing on the Horn of Africa is both in terms of the whole food security, but also this area is the edge of the FOIP strategy, free and open in Pacific strategy. So this instability of this region is a very critical negative impact to the Japanese strategy itself. So I'm not sure exact amount or price of the aid to this area, but the importance for Japanese government to tackle with the food security in this region is, of course, very, very important. And maybe the Japanese government will cooperate with the UN special agencies.
Thank you very much, Mika. Thank you for your comment and your additional question to Etienne. I will now turn finally to Sayoko. Thank you for waiting, and we are now very eager to listen to your remarks.
Okay. Good evening and good morning. So thank you very much, Céline, for your kind introduction. And I'm really honored to be a part of this interesting and timely discussion at Ifri. Regarding the impact of the coronavirus and the war in Ukraine on Africa, our audience is very much aware of the economic deterioration, food shortage, or price hikes on basic commodities. So I would like to share my quick observations from my recent missions in Addis Ababa and Dakar. So I went to Addis Ababa in September just for a couple of days, and at first glance, the capital city seemed so calm, and the supermarkets were full of food. but our several counterparts told us that the inflation was too fast. And I'm afraid that even the middle class in the Addis Ababa may become closer to the poverty line if this trend is continued. In this way, the international community needs to respond quickly to such a crisis situation. At the same time, at the core of the current economic crisis lies a traditional and structural problem of the long term, such as economic diversification, basic service of governance. So the coronavirus and the war in Ukraine have only made it more apparent those long-term developmental challenges. And in terms of security, there are a number of demonstrations due to food shortage or economic crisis. And in addition, several coups and terrorism have increased in the past 2 or 3 years. Yet, we should not understand all these as the effects of Corona or Ukraine, or the war in Ukraine. In this respect, some African leaders like to highlight that threats always come from outside the country or the continent. But I don't think it's a good idea to take such a narrative, as COP are internal matters, and recently terrorism in Africa became much more rooted in the local context. I believe that Africa's commitment to stability, such as ending the civil war or swiftly transferring to civilian rule, is really important. Without it, no matter how much the international community tries to provide assistance, it will not be possible to deliver it in the first place. So it will lead to a vicious circle, making people and countries more vulnerable to external shocks. And restriction of movement had another impact in my sense. During the lockdown, information from SNS social network has flooded while reporting by media has become difficult. In some countries, SNS become so powerful that it now becomes a powerful tool to influence public opinion. While we are unable to travel, we also looked so much at SNS, but it was difficult to judge their contents because of their one-sided information dissemination. So in an environment where virtual communication dominates, it is really difficult to foster trust. On the other hand, there are countries and companies that have expanded their business opportunities during this crisis. For example, while many airlines are in difficult situation due to travel restriction, Ethiopian Airlines continue their operations and strengthen their hub functions. And due to the war in Ukraine, some resource-rich countries such as Algeria have great business opportunities now. So we must expect that such countries would commit to regional stability and provide funds for this end. But if they rush to strengthen military power instead, they would pose a new risk. Well, what was the impact on the Japanese corporation? So due to the travel restriction, we could only understand the situation in a virtual way. And since this year, mission abroad has finally resumed, and the TICAD 8 was held in this summer. So we are now rapidly trying to reconnecting with our African partners. Well, having said that, I just recently went to Dakar to participate in the Dakar Peace and Security Forum. But due to the swelling fears and the severe yen depreciation, traveling to geographical distant places was so difficult. And I'm afraid that this situation will continue for some time. We have already experienced this during the travel restriction under the COVID-19. As Japan is geographically distant from Africa, a cooperation with France and the EU, which are geographically, historically, and economically close to Africa, is very vital for us, as highlighted by Etienne. And what can France and Japanese can foster cooperation on security and stability? I think there's so much idea. There have been several examples of Japan-France cooperation in Africa in the past, like in Cote d'Ivoire or Madagascar. And from Japan's point of view, the acquisition of CFAO through Tatsusho was a great event. And on security side, for example, I heard that Agence Française de Développement, AFD, will strengthen its operation in the Sahel for the governance matter. Also, Japan cannot do on the same scale. There are ways we can cooperate, collaborate. And this is my very personal view, that it is great if we can collaborate on the prevention of conflict, as Japan has made it one of the pillars during the TICAD process. And there is a tremendous need for mediation and dialogue on the ground, and we should support these small steps to prevent this expansion of terrorism and other factors affecting stability. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sayoko, for developing all your insight, sharing your insight on security situation and providing recommendations. I'm sure Christine will also follow up on this issue, and we will discuss it later on with Etienne and then Mika if she's still here. But very interesting to hear this perspective. Thanks a lot. So now, Christine, the floor is finally yours.
I'm coming. Yeah, it's the beauty for talking the last one. That's lots of things have already been said. So thank you so much, Céline, for inviting me, and good morning to everybody. So I think my role here will be more, since I represent an African media group, which name is Financial Afrique, based in Dakar, Senegal, to a little bit give you the way that in Africa, you know, these questions are being seen. And unfortunately, because of the influential war and also in the media and the social network, and the presence of Wagner in most of African countries now that are from the French influence, French-speaking Africa, as we say, it seems impossible not to talk about, you know, a little bit of a history, and especially about France-Afrique, because these are lots of issues in the way they are being seen on the ground in Africa. You know, France-Afrique means sphere of influence, which is the pré-carré, the backyard of France in English. And really, we now have to kind of discuss a little bit, you know, some of the contradiction of French cooperation policy, since on the one hand, you have an intrusion and the willingness of President Macron to talk more to African youth, to civil society, and to make really big more a part of the program of cooperation of France in Africa and also of international relations. And on the other hand, there are a few events that shows that it is not at all the case. So my first question would be to ask if, despite Emmanuel Macron's founding speech in Ouagadougou in 2017, it was the very beginning of his first mandate, announcing the definitive end of France-Afrique. One may wonder, in view of the present rejection of France in some French-speaking African countries, if this is really the case. So among the important events, so of course, you know, we're discussing here the impact of COVID, and the first mandate of President Macron's presidency was impacted by COVID. But before that, I would like to remind you that in August 2017, he founded the Presidential Council for Africa. It's an advisory body composed of people from civil society, members of the African diaspora foremost, while its supporters sees this institution as a way to bring together civil society personalities around issues related to Africa, rather than officials or business leaders. Other sees it as a new bridge between African elites, the diaspora, and French interest in the Africa. This preliminary work with PCA, Presidential Council for Africa, allow during the Ouagadougou speech, President Macron to change, kind of showing the willingness of France to change the perception of Africa and African partners, European partners mainly, towards Africa. So this was made through a different proposal. I will give you the detail if you are interested, but mainly focused towards youth, cultural exchange, higher education proposal, talent passport, of course, visa are very important, as you know, for African students to come to study in France. This was saluted everywhere, and especially in Africa, as being really a new paradigm in French-African relationship. Okay, in terms of hard currency, development assistance to Africa also increased in 2017, and France dedicated more than 12 billion in 2020, equivalent to 0.53% of the national wealth, making it the 5th largest donor of aid in the world. So it was translated into hard currency. I would like also to remind you about the summit on the financing of African economies that took place in Paris on 17 and 8 May 2021, that allow for the launching of new instrument of financing for Africa. Africa was much in demand, and the DTS, the special instruments that IMF is using, to help economies when they're in difficulty, should be donating in the biggest amount to Africa. And also the culmination of this change of paradigm of French cooperation policy towards Africa was the new African-French Summit on 8 October 2021 in Montpellier. This summit focused on young people and civil society in Africa and France and the diasporas. It addressed all topics which are today essential for young people, in particular citizen engagement, entrepreneurship and innovation, higher education, and research cultural projects. Once again, I don't go too much into detail, and I will, complete if you ask me. But in the same time, this was my first point, are we really ending up with France-Afrique? In the same time, President Macron, visited Chad for the funerals of President Idriss Déby, who died while commanding military forces fighting rebels from the front for change and conquered in Chad. Idriss Déby ruled Chad from 1990 to his death, and he was succeeded by his son and Army General Mahamat Déby, who staged what some called an institutional coup d'etat. Therefore, the official visit of the French head of state contributed in legitimizing his authoritarian regime. Indeed, France has a lot to lose in Chad. Since this, if this country will become unstable, this will be a big loss for France, which may explain the visit, but it was very much criticized, including in Africa. Now with the departure of Barkhane, Niger may be taking more and more this role, since France has to depart from Mali, as you know. Now, quickly, what to expect from the second mandate of Emmanuel Macron, which started in April 2022, that will finish in 2027, in the context of war in Ukraine. Of course, despite lots of attacks perpetrated against France and the loss of image that France is encountering in lots of French-speaking Africa, of the Sahel especially, France is not going to depart from Africa. Etienne Giraud mentioned, the closeness of our ties. Let me quote Christophe Bigot, Africa and Indian Ocean Director at the Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs, when he says, that our nearest neighbor, Africa, has become part of our identity through a common history and Africa diasporas in France. While many of our citizens' roots are in Africa, more than 150,000 French people are living in sub-Saharan Africa and nearly 500,000 on the continent overall. France is also part of the African region with its two departments in the Indian Ocean, Réunion and Mayotte, where over 1 million French people live. With such figures, it's absolutely impossible for France to depart Africa, as you can imagine. But of course, now the competition has increased quite a lot, and we are experiencing with the return of Russia, a context of growing geopolitical and geoeconomics competition, including with other European countries like Germany, Spain, or Italy. This is one of the new points. The war in Ukraine also brought the necessity, for example, for Germany to reconsider its implication also on security level in Africa. And it's now becoming more and more present, not only economically, so challenging French interest in sub-Saharan Africa, but also on a military point of view. So among the main challenge for France, of course, the security and counterterrorism challenges remain very big. As said, the departure of Barkhane, which was officially announced yesterday, but decided early in February 2022, does not mean that France is going to abandon Sahel, because its own interests are at stake. On the economic front, Africa is expected to continue to experience very strong economic growth into the decades ahead, despite being affected by the impact of the pandemic in the 2020 and 21 greatly. But as Etienne Giraud explained earlier, of course, Africa is a very interesting markets for French companies. They've been there very, very long, and they are not going to depart, although BNP, the French bank, and other group announced that they were going to depart. I just realized an interview with Société Générale, which is celebrating its 60th birthday of implantation in Africa, and they are not at all willing to depart Africa, since it's a very lucrative market for them. Among the other global challenges, and then perhaps we come more, to discuss the cooperation, the French-Japanese cooperation with Africa that could be very useful. There are, of course, major global issues from climate change to migration management, which can only be solved with strong African engagement. There is the future of the French language and Francophonie, which is perhaps more peculiar to France, since France wants to develop an economic zone, Francophonia, economic zone with projects to boost, economic investment for French-speaking Africa. And since African countries like France are committed to defending multilateralism, and their interests are aligned with those of France when it comes to promoting better global governance, there has been lots of initiatives taken by France, which seems more and more to be willing to align several stakeholders and making alliance to finance international projects. So just to finish my presentation, as I said, I've been very pleasantly surprised of the length and sustainability of France-Japan partnership for Africa. Some of the programs were mentioned, but it goes from TICAD 6, which took place in Nairobi, Kenya, to TICAD 8, which took place also in Africa, in Egypt. TICAD 7 was in Japan. But since then, lots of projects have been put into places and are being implemented with, I suppose, diverse financing, which is, seems to be the problem. And thank you, Professor Mika, for presenting TICAD 8 to emphasize sustainability, because this, it seems to be really the key term for trying to develop and strengthen even further French-Japanese ties and cooperation towards Africa. Unfortunately, I have not a very good news. I was also very surprised that my newspaper, Financial Afrique, did not give much coverage to TICAD 8, except for mentioning some, political difficulties, but not really going into the programs of what could be achieved. And this is probably because of this pledge that Japan made to Africa, the 30 billion, but obviously seem not to have been implemented until now, and perhaps let you know about a certain deception from the ground on the part of Africa, that some of the pledges that were made were not being implemented. As for what TICAD, after TICAD 8 could be implemented further, it seems to me that, of course, in the context of COP27 in Egypt, one may say that there is a bright future for cooperation in climate change, especially because there are already quite a lot of projects of French-Japanese cooperation in terms of renewable energies, and companies in both countries are already working on that. So things exist. Let's make them sustainable. I think it's really the key word. And of course, France is trying to launch the initiative Farm to increase food security. And in the context of the war in Ukraine, Africa has been hit very, very badly for cereals shortage and things like this. And it's very, very important not only to help Africa to get, not to have shortage of food, but it's one of the most interesting part of this program, which France wants to have financed internationally, but to help African economies to develop their own productivity in agriculture. And I think this is really the keyword for sustainability. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christine, for this very broad overview of the various pros and cons of the French engagement in Africa, and also a lot of food for thought for future cooperation between France and Japan. Now, in the interest of time, I would like to go back to each of you for your reactions towards the other's presentation, but I would like also to add some questions that were raised by the audience, or my own my own question while I was listening to you. So maybe Etienne, we can start with you. I would be curious to hear your thought and your reaction after the presentation of Sayoko and Christine, and you have also some questions about the free trade area initiative in Africa. How is it seen from the private sector? Is it something positive, and to which extent do you think it will facilitate the investment and the exchange? And also, I would be happy to push you a little bit more on the Franco-Japanese cooperation at the private sector level on the African continent, because we have already some very successful success stories, so to say, between French and Japanese companies. But at the same time, we have a certain level of competition, of course, on some sectors on the continent. So, what are your thoughts on the prospect for increased cooperation or coordination between the French and Japanese private sector? And also, because you have European hats, I would like to ask you about the European Global Gateway Initiative. There is also, as you know, a EU-Japan partnership on sustainable connectivity and quality infrastructure. And what are your views on that? Do you think there are some useful framework to develop the coordination in Africa, or is it still kind of a very broad announcement, and it's difficult to advance on any concrete project right now? So, Etienne, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Céline, for this very, very large program of questions. So I will take not more than 1 hour. No, I am joking. No, maybe, yes. With your permission, I would like to raise very shortly 2, 3, or 4 points in fact, not really in a very built speech. First, one information on the IMF initiative, the famous DTS, which is, as you remember, explored during the French African financing summit in May, I think it was 21 in Paris. Christine mentioned it, and I was participating to this summit. And the main conclusion of this summit is that a lot of funding amounts are dedicated or given to IMF members, state members, and the African state members were only allowed to get $33 billion of new funding. And the involvement of the North countries, especially pushed by President Macron, was to retransfer from their envelope $100 billion to African countries. And the information I would like to share with you, which is very fresh because I got it yesterday night, is that today, as from today, the amount already granted to Africa from this $100 billion is up to 83 already, which is quite a good news. Now, I'm not sure that the money is already available, but the decision is taken. And it was not sure 1 year ago because it was not so easy. And there has been a common move from the North countries to grant this money to the African countries. So that's the first good news. Second point, totally different. I would like to say 1 or 2 words on the French bashing and on the French position in Africa, mentioned also by Christine. In my view, yes, first, it does exist. It's for sure. It's stupid to deny that. So yes, it does exist. But first is very much concentrated on Sahel countries. Get out of your mind that there is a global French bashing in the 54 countries of Africa. It is very much concentrated on Francophone countries, and among these Francophone countries, on Sahel countries. So it is much more a French bashing against the French government. I'm not happy of that, but it's a fact. And it's not a French bashing against France, against our population, and against our companies and private sector, which is quite a good news. That's the first point. The second point is that it is largely a French bashing which is manipulated. It's a very big manipulation from foreign interests, especially, let's say the word, especially from Russia, and also from opposition sides, political opposition sides, domestic opposition sides, because it's very useful for opposition politicians to use the French bashing issues and subjects to make them well known on their country. So it's also a manipulation. Third point, it still does exist a very strong desire for France. Yes, it does exist. And we know that the population in those countries like to work with French companies. And they are types claiming a much more French presence, not military presence, but economical presence. And it is the reasons why I try to explain to the companies that, yes, there is an aversion of risk. Yes, the image is not good. And when President Macron announced yesterday the end of Barkhane operation, it is seen that the French departure, France quits Africa, you see, in very simple words. It's not the truth. And feels to invest in Africa, us French companies, and it is exactly the same for European companies. Second remark. Third remark. I have seen a question, a written question on the Zoom chat regarding the blended finance. Somebody from AFD, Agence Française de Développement, asked why the blended finance, in his opinion, is not totally operating correctly. In my view, yes. First, I think he is right. I think I see several reasons for that. First, it is too much complicated. Sorry if I am very basic, but our members, the majority of our company members, don't understand how it works. The global gateway, the huge global gateway, I remind you the amounts from the European Union, 350 billion euros, out of which, 350 euros, out of which 150 billion dedicated to Africa. Huge amount, UP, everybody is very happy, etc. But we don't know how we can get the first euro of that. What is the path? Is there a unique guichet? To whom are we going, or are we supposed to speak? Can we propose project? We don't know that. And we are saying that very clearly to European Union. We don't understand. They explain with a lot of pillars, objectives, and so on. But at the end of the day, when I say to a member, yes, there is a lot of money available to Africa, and probably you can get some to finance your projects. Okay, but how do I operate? We don't know. So it is a common call. We can share this call. Please facilitate the operations. And the last point of the difficulty of blended finance is the fact that we are facing a lot of limitations. I give some explanation. For example, when you have a project to finance, you explain the project to international funders. And you will face the fact that, for example, 20, 25, 30 countries are not eligible in Africa. The one is not a democratic country. The other one is too small. The other one is not in the habitual or usual area, and so on, you see. So you are disappointed. I have a project in Comore or in Cape Verde, and the answer will be no, too small, it's not my area, it's not possible, and so on. And secondly, be aware that for financing private projects, there is a huge hole between 1 million euro and 20 billion euro to be financed. I explain. if you want to get a loan or a financing for example, 500,000 euro, you can find it through private banks and so on, quite easily. Very expensive with huge guarantees and so on, but you can find it. If you have a project over 20 million euro, you can find it also to international lenders because it's a huge amount. But in the middle, it's very difficult because a lot of operators say, look, it is too small for me to open the file. And for example, all the operators who want 5 million, 8 million, they don't find even somebody to speak with. So it is a difficulty. And to conclude on this point, I repeat what I said just before. Please accept, I am speaking to the international lenders, accept to organize much more call for projects, for project, not call for programs, call for project, which is not the same. Call for program is Mr. the state of Senegal, the state of Kenya, what is and what are your programs? My way is, I come to you, private sector, to Alstom, to agricultural companies, to Japanese companies. What have you as projects in your office? What are your projects and not your programs? So that's my point on blended finance. Sorry if I've been too long. Now, a question of African continental free trade area. I will be very short. We are totally in favor of that. Why? Because it will increase the size of the markets. And I explain you that one of our problems is that the size of the African market is small, and it is a problem. So once you increase the size of the market by opening the borders, you will favor it and will be in favor. It will be in favor of investment. And the last point, yes, of course, we are totally in favor of the increase of the cooperation between Japanese and French companies towards Africa. I remind that we have a famous example, which is the big French company called CFAO, Compagnie Française de l'Afrique Occidentale, which is a very old company, and now it is owned by Japanese interest since now, I think, 20 years or 25 years, or not 15 years. And the Japanese shareholding led the management in France. Why? Because I think that we have an expertise and the long story. It is one of our advantage. So I would like to monopolize, I don't want to monopolize the floor, so I'll stop, Céline.
Thank you very much, Etienne. Yeah, the time is running and we have only a few minutes left. So I would like to give the chance to Sayoko to reply, to react to all that. And maybe to answer the question, some of the questions that we had about Japanese companies' perception of risk in Africa as it changed. And I would add, do you think that the $30 billion announcement is achievable or not? And I'm sure you have also some other remarks.
Okay, thank you very much, Céline. So I will be very quick. And how the Japanese company's perception has changed. Well, during the COVID and the war in Ukraine, I think there's not so much changed. But I see there are some promising changes, like in the automotive sector. Recently, Toyota Tsusho or Seifel they have recently opened an assembly plant in Ghana, and I think there are another project in pipeline. So I don't know if we can really achieve the $30 billion in 3 years, and we have to see that. Thank you. And let me ask my comment or a question for you, for Etienne and Christine. For Japan, the advantage of partnering with France are multiple, such as aid and development or public-private partnership in French-speaking countries where we have little knowledge and networks. On the other hand, France seems to want to enter the non-French speaking countries or region by collaborating with Japanese companies. So how can we coordinate our interests? Thank you.
Thank you, Sayoko. Oh my God, we we have only 4 minutes left. Christine, if you would like to react to the and to respond to Sayoko's questions. Also, Alain Antil is asking you: is the anti-French sentiment in French-speaking Africa countries cyclical or more serious and deep? You're muted, Christine.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Sayoko. Yeah, absolutely. It was one of the, Etienne should have said it, but it's one of the big tendency, and it has been increasing, that actually France is much more involved economically in English-speaking Africa than it is now, although, you know, there's a tradition. The presence of the French companies has been traditionally very, very big. But it's interesting because actually contestation, to just answer also Alain, contestation is coming from French-speaking Africa because, and I think this is where French-Japanese cooperation should work more. Well, French-speaking African countries are lacking infrastructure, and a big point of Franco-Japanese cooperation in Africa has been on infrastructure. And this is where, you know, you cannot finance infrastructure one day and stop financing the day after. It's impossible. We're talking about very long-term projects. So it needs not only the money, the cash flow, you know, which is very big, and then perhaps PPP, more PPP should be very welcome, and perhaps more PPP in between France and Japan could help that, although we are all running after the money, you know, in times of COVID. Nobody has money anymore. So, but we could invent some new instruments. But to finance this kind of infrastructure that Africa, and especially French-speaking Africa, because French companies, let's, you know, without doing French bashing, let's face it, French companies made a lot of money, but they did not develop French-speaking countries. Infrastructures are very low, and they didn't develop themselves since independence 60 years ago either. So the needs is there, and perhaps, you know, in terms of helping Africa to just be able to industrialize, which it is not yet. Africa is not industrialized. Nigeria, a country like Nigeria is, but most, even Ivory Coast, has very, very few industrialization, which is, you know, the leading country in the French-speaking group. So to help Africa industrialize, it needs absolutely more help to develop its infrastructure.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Christine. Etienne, would you like to add a last word reacting to both Sayoko and Christine?
Last word, yes. Only to mention that, yes, the French interests are very much focused on French-speaking countries, as number of companies, as a turnover and so on. But I would like to remind you that the 3 first countries as turnover for French companies are Anglophone countries, are English-speaking countries: South Africa, Nigeria, and Egypt. Mm-hmm. Everyone has to know that, really. Secondly, regarding the infrastructure, the competitive, the industrialization of the French-speaking countries, I would like to mention that the main issue is that those countries, and we have to be competitive. It is not only the point of infrastructure. We have to be competitive, and if we want to create added value in those countries and produce there, in the worldwide competition, we have to be competitive. So we have to get energy, we have to get education, and we have to go good rule of law and business climate. So if we are not competitive, we can speak for years and years, it will happen nothing. So we have to work on the competitivity of those economies. I stop it saying because I think the time is over for me. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Etienne. Yeah, the time is over, and I feel that we could spend much more on these very interesting issues. I think we had a very fascinating discussion. I think it was very fruitful to have this cross perspective from both France and Japan, and from the private sectors, government, experts, and so on. It was absolutely great to have you all, and I hope that we will reconvene maybe at the next TICAD to debrief on the progress or challenges. And with that, I wish you all a great day or great evening, and hope to see you soon for our next event. So thanks a lot for the great panelists. I really enjoyed the discussions today. Thanks a lot. Have a good day.
Goodbye.